Hello, and today we're going to be taking a look at a discontinued tool. At least I believe it's discontinued because it's no longer on their website. The Hart HGPR0301VNM 50 PSI rinser. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first up we have the battery compartment. Now the battery compartment is located on the side of the tool and will accept the Hart 20 volt batteries. It should be able to accept up to a 6 amp hour battery, although I'm not 100% positive on this since I do not have a 6 amp hour battery to test it, but I do know that it works with a 4 amp hour battery, so your usage may vary depending on how big of a battery you have. Overall, the compartment itself should keep the batteries dry from any sort of sprays or splashes that may get away from you, but I definitely wouldn't trust it against any sort of submersion because that would probably ruin the tool and your battery. So it's pretty much just a water resistant compartment and nothing more than that. But it does get the job done and does keep the battery dry even when you gently spray water onto it. So I have zero complaints when it comes to the battery bay, and everything here works as intended. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the LED light. This is a nice feature for when you're working after dark, but it's not all that bright of a light and is basically just 3 LED lights behind a water resistant panel. The switch itself is controlled via a push button style switch, which is behind a rubber cover to protect it against any sort of water ingress. Overall, it's a fairly simple design, doesn't put out much light, but is still useful for letting you know where the tool is and, well, for seeing the basic controls on the side of the tool. So at the end of the day, it's not that impressive, but it is a nice feature to have, so, well, it gets a pass. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the power button. Now the power button is located on the side of the tool like pretty much everything else and is a basic flip style switch with a rubber cover to protect it against any sort of water splashes or streams. Quite frankly, it's a fairly simple design but effective. Now it's a simple on-off and there really is no other settings. You may think that there's a high and low setting judging by the description, but no, the description of 30 psi and 50 psi has to do with its power source, but we'll cover the other power source here in a second. Overall, nothing really else to say about this except for the fact that if you do disconnect or want to reconnect the hose, you will have to turn off the machine because it's pretty much impossible to, well, reconnect the hose otherwise. So yeah, that's about it. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the alternative power source, which is going to be this 12 volt port on the side of the tool. Now, this is a cool feature to have and is going to make this a vastly more interesting tool to use in a variety of situations. But there are a couple of things to keep in mind when you are using the 12 volt power source. One, you can only plug it into, well, a cigarette lighter because that's the other end of the cable, and so you're going to be limited on what you can use this with. Think of, say, a portable power station or a car cigarette jack. One of the two will work for powering this particular tool. Another issue with this is, well, it's not going to be nearly as water resistant because when that cover is off, there's going to be a place for water to get into the tool and into connections. So that's something else to keep in mind. And then another problem is it's sort of a more unique design here. It's not a standard barrel jack like you'll find on a lot of 12 volt power tools. It's going to be a, well, kind of unique design, similar to what you'd find plugged into the back of an old cassette or CD player, but not exactly the same either. I don't know, it's not a port I've ever really seen before, but I've seen ones very similar. So, quite frankly, that's another sort of, well, problem. And last but not least, you're going to be dealing with a decreased amount of power. You'll only have 30 psi instead of the 50 psi because of the lower power source. But as long as you can live with all those caveats, it's still a nice feature to have, and it will still make this a vastly more useful tool in a lot of different circumstances. So I like it. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the hose. Now the hose on this particular tool is actually sort of an interesting design. It is fairly long, coming in at 20 feet in length, blue in coloring, and has a fairly small diameter, which means you're not going to be using this for, well, washing the car because you're just not going to be moving enough water. But it's still going to be useful for, well, hosing off your kids at the beach after you get done playing all day, or, well, showering off the dog after he's been in the mud puddle at the park. So quite frankly, it's a very good design, and I do like pretty much everything about it. It's very flexible and easy to tidy up when you get done using the tool because it seems to remember what shape it needs to go in, but it's not so stiff that it's hard to work with when you're trying to chase your dog around your legs to get the mud showered off of him. So I don't really have any major, well, gripes or problems with the design here, and everything seems to be fairly well thought out. So as far as I'm concerned, everything here gets a pass. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the water storage tank. Now the storage tank for storing the water on this particular tool is going to be made out of a white plastic and is semi-translucent so that you can tell where the water level is currently at. There is an integrated handle that has been molded into the shape of the tank and is fairly robust. The tank itself is made out of a fairly thick plastic, so I have zero worries about accidental punctures, and you'd have to be pretty deliberate in order to actually puncture the tank on this particular tool. So everything seems to be fairly well designed and robust. The shape of the tank is longer rather than wider, which means that you'll be able to tuck it into your vehicle when you're packing lots of different things in there easier than say something that was square or round. So I think that it's a very good design, and everything seems to work fairly well. I haven't noticed any sort of leaks when the tool is on its side or on its back, but I still would always transport it in the upright position just to stay safe. So yeah, that's about all I can say for the storage tank. It seems to be perfectly adequate and it gets the job done. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the sprayer. Now the sprayer in this particular tool is made out of plastic and is connected to the hose with a quick connect adapter. There are 8 different spray patterns for you to choose from, but unfortunately they are missing a jet setting. They do have a stream setting, but the hole in that is far too large, and I would definitely have preferred a, well, jet setting so that you could shoot the water further and at a little bit higher velocity. But unfortunately we did not get that with the included sprayer. Now the sprayer itself is controlled via a lever on the back of the sprayer, which allows you to turn the sprayer on and off when it's sitting on its mounting point or its holder, and this is going to be useful for when you need to use the sprayer or rinser as a sink, and quite frankly it works great for that purpose. Well, I guess it's not really a sink, it's a faucet, because you get the point. Now, everything else here is fairly standard. The holder is also made out of a plastic, which is fairly flexible, but it's also that kind of plastic that, well, gets brittle super easy if it's left out in the sun too long. So I would definitely, well, keep this in the shade or have a towel over it for any sort of extended sun exposure. So at the end of the day, it's definitely a useful design, and I definitely like the fact that they have a holder which is easy to use and easy to get the tool out of, but is secure enough where you can walk around without having to worry about the sprayer falling out. So everything is, well, perfectly fine except for the one missing feature, and everything here gets a pass from me. Moving on. Okay, last but not least, we have the cap. Now the cap is going to be made out of a blue soft plastic and features a vacuum release valve as well as a rubber seal to make sure that the water doesn't spill out. Quite frankly, everything here is designed very well and very effectively. It's easy for you to grasp with your bare hands or with gloves on, and it's going to be, well, completely adequate for keeping liquids on the inside of the tank, which should always be water because this thing should only contain water. So at the end of the day, I don't really have any other complaints or any other thoughts about the cap, and it works as intended, and I haven't noticed any water leaks. So as far as I'm concerned, the cap is completely adequate and gets the job done. Moving on. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about this particular tool in use. And I have to say, it's actually a very handy tool in a variety of different situations. For me personally, I use it as a power pump for my power cleaners or as a sink, and I've been toying with the idea of using it as an outdoor shower as well, but just haven't gotten around to building the stall area yet. But for me personally, I think that this particular tool fits my own particular needs extremely well, and I'm very happy that it exists. I would only be happier if, well, maybe Ryobi made something like this. Cough, 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 staring at you, Ryobi. And, well, quite frankly, I would also be very happy if they came up with something very similar to this that had quite a bit more power. Say an easy clean that was in the same format where you have a very small wand that you can use. I don't know. For me personally, that would be a very interesting and fun tool to have, especially when you need to clean feed bowls for animals. But that's just my own personal preference and, well, wish list. Now, the reason why I personally think this tool got discontinued is probably because, well, it didn't get advertised all that well, and I think a lot of people just didn't know it existed. I can see how a lot of people in four-wheeling or disaster recovery groups, or people who live in the middle of nowhere and don't have access to reliable water sources, could find this to be a very useful and interesting tool. So, honestly, I think if Hart had done a little bit more of a advertising campaign for this particular tool, it probably would have did much better, and it wouldn't be, well, practically discontinued at this point. Now, if you are interested in trying to pick up one of these particular tools, I believe they still have them in stock at certain Tool Direct stores, but it's in-store only and you can't order them from offline, so you may have to talk to a buddy in another state or make a long drive to try to locate one of these. But with that being said, I kind of doubt that it's going to get, well, recontinued and back in stock at Walmart.com, where I purchased this particular tool about a year ago. And I have to say that is a disappointment, because honestly, I really think that there is a market for this sort of a tool, especially in a package like this where everything's contained in one easy to use platform. So it is a disappointment to see that it's been discontinued. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to the pros and cons. 20 volt. 20 volt means that this will work with all your Hart 20 volt batteries, and it does supply quite a bit of power. Unfortunately, because of the design of the battery compartment, I am unsure if you can adapt batteries over from other brands via third-party adapter, and if you can do that, it would have to be a much smaller battery to be able to fit inside the compartment. So unfortunately, I kind of doubt that that will work on this particular tool. 20-foot hose. Now, a 20-foot hose on a power washer is too short, but a 20-foot hose on this particular tool is more than enough, and I'm very glad that they decided to include one of that length. So in my opinion, this is a pro. 5-gallon tank. 5 gallons is quite a bit of water for a tool like this, and honestly, that does make it a little bit on the heavy side. So I can understand why some people might find that to be a little bit of a con and might prefer something that had a much smaller 3-gallon tank, but for me personally, this is a pro. 12-volt cord. Having the ability to use a 12-volt cord to power this particular tool is a nice feature, and I'm glad that they included it. However, I do wish that the connector to attach it to the tool was a little bit more standardized and not as unique as it is. Also, having a little bit more length would be good, but 8 feet is quite a bit of length for that sort of a cord, so your usage may vary and your own personal preference may vary, but for me personally, this is a pro. LED light. I do wish that the LED light was stronger, but I am glad that it's included on the body of the tool, because that means that you won't have to worry about adding a separate light in order to get more illumination so you can see the controls on the tool. So in my opinion, this is a pro. Pressure off. The pressure off is a nice feature, because if the motor was always running, that would be highly annoying, and it would be much more of a hassle to use in a variety of situations. Not to mention that it would wear down your battery far quicker. So in my opinion, this is a pro. And the first con is, well, it's practically discontinued at this point. Who knows, maybe they'll do another production run and it'll be back in stock someday, but for me personally, I kind of doubt it. So in my opinion, this is a con. And the next con is the unusual 12-volt jack. It's not a common jack that you'll see on a bunch of different tools, and so unfortunately, if your cord does get damaged or lost, or you just need a longer one, it's going to be a bit of a pain to, well, rig it to run otherwise. Moving on. No jet setting. It does have a stream setting, but the diameter of that hole is just too large. If they had had a smaller diameter hole and they labeled it jet, this definitely would have been a far more interesting tool. I'm not quite sure why TTI absolutely hates and despises zero and jet settings, but that's something they need to fix on their products. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to my final thoughts on the tool. And that is it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular tool. I really do like this particular tool, but I can see how some people might not like it because of the size, weight, or price. I do hope that they do end up coming out with another tool similar to this. Maybe something that you can put on top of a 5-gallon bucket, or maybe just a smaller form factor version of this, or maybe one of these that has a higher pressure setting that you can use as a low power cleaner. I don't know. This is definitely a very interesting tool, and it comes in handy in a variety of different situations. So in my opinion, it's definitely worth the price, and so as far as I'm concerned, if you can find one, this tool comes recommended. And that is it for this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe, and we will see you next time. God bless.